I got this on Facebook Marketplace for free, and if we haven't met yet, I'm Jade. I'm a solo mum flipping furniture to fund my dream home. The piece was in great condition. It was just dated. It had that real 2000s country kitchen vibe, and I wanted to turn it into something that was a little bit more modern country. I started by removing these LED light doors, and I had absolutely no intention of putting them back on. I wanted to have open shelves because I think it gives people an opportunity to actually showcase their trinkets, their little bits and pieces. It doesn't hide them away behind doors. The next thing I wanted to do was remove this scallop trim that was along the bottom. However, it was supporting too much timber to just bash it off with my hammer. I knew I'd have to use my jigsaw, so I got an old piece of timber to use as a guide. What I'm actually doing here is I'm putting the blade of the jigsaw at the lowest point of that trim, and then I'm putting the piece of timber up against the little silver foot that is on the jigsaw at the very bottom. Now, I found I had to do 2 cuts for this because my first cut just wasn't taking off enough timber. You can see here. So I just followed the same steps. I altered where my guide was, lined it up with the little foot at the bottom, and then made a second cut. And let me tell you, it is much better to have to make a second cut than to go in and cut too much timber off. I then went around and cleaned the sections where I would be applying wood filler. So where I removed the hinges, there were some holes, and I wanted to get that drying because I knew I'd have to do a couple of rounds of wood filler to get it looking nice and flush. I did try to use my CARRBIDE scraper on the shelves, but I just wasn't getting enough pressure to take enough finish off. So I knew I'd have to go in with my sander, which meant I need to clean down the surface first. I get a lot of questions about why I do this, and the simple answer is that if you have dirt, grease and grime sitting on the surface of this timber and you go ahead and put your sander onto it, you are going to drive that dirt, grease, grime further down into the timber that's underneath, which will stop your finishes from adhering to the surface properly later on. Luckily, I was able to use my CARRBIDE scraper on the top of the piece, and it just goes to show what you can achieve when you can use the correct amount of pressure. One thing I do notice people saying about the CARRBIDE scraper is, it makes this horrendous nails down a chalkboard sound, and that's because you're not applying enough pressure. I went around with a vinegar and water mix to clean everything down, and I removed the doors. And this is because I had planned to paint the internal part of this cupboard as well. And to get my spray gun in there, I like to have the doors off. Then came the most time-consuming part of this entire flip, and that was getting these shelves down to raw timber. I used a combination of my sheet sander, hand sanding, and then my orbital sander in the end to remove all of the finish. However, if I had to do this again, I would absolutely go in with a chemical-based stripper to remove everything first. It took around an hour and a half to sand all of the shelves and around 10 minutes to sand the entire buffet top. I worked my way up from 120 grit sandpaper to 150, followed by 180 and 240, and then went back down to 120 grit sandpaper to scuff sand where I was going to be painting. It's important that you go around and scuff your piece prior to priming because primers don't like to stick to a super slick, glossy surface. So you are going around and scuffing up the surface with that 120 grit sandpaper so that your primer will adhere effectively. If your primer fails, it'll start to chip off, and that means that any paint that you have put over the top of that primer will also chip off. You can do this by hand with an orbital sander or a detail sander, but the main idea is you don't want any gloss on the surface. You want it to be a nice milky finish, no shine. Dust is not your friend when you are going to be painting, so you want to make sure that when you have finished scuff sanding that you remove all of the dust. To ensure I didn't get any overspray onto my freshly sanded shelves, I used painter's tape and some butcher's paper just to make sure that I was covering everything up. I went in with Zinza water-based primer for this piece because my paint color in the end was a dark shade. And if you are having trouble choosing the right primer for what application, I made a dedicated video to primer that you can find in my beginner's tips playlist. Prior to painting, I went around with 400 grit sandpaper and removed all of the dust. And I like to do this so that I get the smoothest finish possible. It's especially important when you're spraying outside as well because little particles of dust, sand, bugs, grass, things can land in your paintwork, and you just want to make sure that you've got none of that coming through for your final coats. I repurposed handles for this piece from a previous flip. However, I didn't want them to be a super shiny new brass. So I actually spray painted them with some black paint and then came around with a towel and just dabbed off a little bit of the excess to give almost a faux tarnished look. Once my paint was dry, I went around with 400 grit sandpaper across the entire piece, removed all of the dust before going on to my second coat of paint. To keep my timber looking nice and neutral, I went in with a paint wash just to knock out a little bit of the warmth that comes through when you normally apply a polyurethane or a wax. You can achieve so many outcomes with paint washing. You can cool timber down, you can keep it looking neutral, or you could warm it up. And I have a guide through the link in my bio, which will teach you everything that you need to know about paint washing, how to prep, how to mix up, how to choose your colors, and how to seal for longevity in the end. To get the smoothest finish possible on the top of your piece when you are paint washing though, you need to sand in between each coat and you need to sand at the end. And this is because anytime that you put water back onto the surface of your timber, you are going to raise the grain or swell the grain. And lightly sanding will just knock down anything that's decided to pop up. While my paint wash was drying, I got all of the hardware back onto my piece. So I got my drawer runners back on, I got my hinges back onto my doors, and I started drilling some new holes for my handles. I highly recommend buying some type of template if you are going to be changing up your hardware on a regular basis. It just makes things so much easier. You can buy them online and they have holes already, which are standard sizes for most of your handles, or you can buy the Craig jig where you can customize it. To seal the top of my timber piece, I went in with FIDDES Hard Wax Oil in Matte. It's such a beautiful product to apply. You can see here that I'm using a brush. However, you can use a roller to apply this one as well. It's water resistant, it's stain resistant, and it's food safe. So you can use it on dining tables and kitchen benches, but it's also toy safe. So it's great if you have little people. This is straight after I had applied my first coat. I did a total of 2 coats of the FIDDES Hard Wax, sanding in between with a brown paper bag, and look at that beautiful matte finish. And guys, this is the end result. I'm absolutely obsessed with how this turned out. I think it's a beautiful contrast between the natural timber and the charcoal tone, and those aged brass handles have just tied everything together. I can definitely see this going into a modern country home. Let me know what you guys think. Is it a nail or a fail?